Hello friends, today we are going to be mansplaining the shit out of Federici, Re-enchantment of the World, and as you know, we here in the cyberpunk realm know that there is no going back to any form of wondrous utopian past. Instead, we must fall in love with the landfill as is. For those of you who think that I'm critiquing feminist ideology from the outside, I will tell you that I have been a male feminist for a very long time, and in fact, I am probably the most well-read male feminist that you know. I was in fact in the front lines of every locker room conversation, calling people out and doing all the things that feminism had asked me to do, until the day I found myself between two groups of feminists, the TERFs and the SWERFs and the SMURFs, all these different groups of feminists. They were yelling at each other, calling each other misogynists, saying that it's too much emotional labor to educate the other side. And as a result, I realized that there is something really rotten at the core of feminism, and that is what I am right now talking about, because I think that complicity is an incredibly important issue to talk about. Incommensurability between our different groups within our so-called intersectional rainbow washing solidarity destroying perspectives. It is so important, ironically, to have a heterosexual male perspective within our intersectionality, and that is what we are missing. And as a result, we are paying the price, and we are paving the way to hell with our good intentions. But instead, as I've said before, the key to opening up the gates of heaven is a devil's advocate. The devil's advocate is the one who holds the key to the heaven of solidarity that we might come across. So, before we continue, first, anything I don't talk about with regards to Silvia Federici, I already agree. Second, you will have to take a look at my critique of the other great god of feminism. Today is Bell Hooks, and you should definitely take a look at that critique. I will be mansplaining with reference to many different women philosophers, including Hannah Arendt and a female historian here. Reddit name is Sun Against Gold. So we're going to be starting our critique of Federici with a critique of the Caliban and the Witch, which is her primary go-to, her biggest work. And I think that it's really important to look at that work because a lot of the things that she does in Re-enchanting the World, a lot of the mistakes that she makes, she continues over into Re-enchanting the World from Caliban and the Witch. I'm not going to go to do an in-depth study of Caliban and the Witch, and this text is going to explain why. Firstly, Federici isn't a historian writing history. She's not critically analyzing primary source evidence and then recent secondary scholarship of light of each other to draw new conclusions about how we can best understand the past. Wie es ich licht war. She's a philosopher writing a philosophical critique of a philosophical system in which she happens to take her talking points from the things that 19th and 20th century scholars said about the past. Detethered from being an explanation of history, there's a lot to be said for understanding and financially valuing reproductive labor as labor. There's a lot to be said, and we're going to be getting into that. There's a lot to be said for gendering Marxism in both its original form and in the sense of a modern Marxist actual historical writing. It exists and can be quite excellent. But that doesn't mean Federici has important insight about understanding the late Middle Ages and the early modern era, and especially witch panic. And her motivations shape that disjunction at every turn. First, this historian is not going to be talking about the philosophical and the political science, but we are. First, we're going to be using her as our historical basis. Foucault doesn't make up history. He makes genealogy. He doesn't make up history from scratch. It's a big difference between what Foucault is doing and a kind of mythologization, a feminist revisionism of history that Federici and many others are doing. And as a result, that feminist revision of history works as a kind of obfuscation. First, she explains in her preface that she started out with a conclusion developed in the mid-80s in the course of writing another book and looked for evidence to support it. This is a very bad sign for serious historiography. And guess what? This is a very bad sign for any type of academic work. Because, like interpreting the Bible, you can make the past mean a lot of the things based on which evidence you choose and how you use it. It's an archival issue. What you choose to include already presupposes what you will end up with. And that's a big problem. It's a problem of self-fulfilling prophecy. She latched onto witch trials, which I'm guessing, based on their position in the late 80s and 90s, historiography and popular culture as a hot topic of research, a hot topic of feminist research, a hot topic of research starring nasty men being nasty. Example, my advisor. And a hot topic of materially minded, the body, feminist research. And she was not going to let go, no matter what the actual evidence and current, that is early 90s, from here on out, research said. Second, a Marxist writing about Marxism, Federici, as a supposed Marxist, talking about Marxism, which she's not, and we're going to be critiquing that, Federici picks a narrow swath of historiography to base her understanding of the late Middle Ages and 16th century on. She cites almost exclusively for big picture stuff Hilton and Lee. Also, she can't even get Lee's name right. Henry Charles, not Charles Henry. We are not in Hamilton here. Hilton is a famous and groundbreaking Marxist historian who understood late medieval turmoil in strictly class terms. Although his understanding of class was nuanced in a way that actually aligns with more recent discoveries about so-called peasant rebellions not really being very peasanty in a lot of cases. Lee was one of the most important medieval historians of all time, whose relevant book here on Inquisition in the Middle Ages was published in 1906. Federici chooses these works because they line up with the narrative she needs to tell to make her point. The most glaring omission in her historiography is the lack of R.I. Moore's The Formation of Persecuting Society, first published in 1987, and enormously important book in medieval historiography. She knew about it. It's particularly bad because Moore tells a non-Marxist and non-purposefully feminist version of a very similar narrative. He argues for the genesis of modern European society in oppression, not as capitalism grinding out the centuries of replicating feudal oppressive categories, but for cultural and political power as well as reifying class distinctions, but class being stereotyped through particular oppressed groups. In other words, when Federici published Caliban, medievalists were buzzing with the same basic phenomenon expressed in a different language. An explicitly feminist intervention in that narrative would have been amazing at that time. Frankly, still might be if you can get a use of D.N. Eliot's work as jumping off point to be critiqued and nuanced instead of accepted full-heartedly. But I digress. I started off with a critique against Caliban and the Witch, but I realized there's so much I'm not a historian and I can't do the historical thing. So I start with just talking about the empirical cracks within her work, and those empirical cracks basically grow into a whole swath of feminist hive mind Instagram philosophies that are just destroying solidarity. Third, Moore was telling the medieval side of a story even more important for contemporary scholars of the early modern era. Federici's major focus after background chapters, where she's pulling from Hilton and Lee with some scattered other bits. Now in the early 90s, Reformation early modern scholarship was undergoing its own plate tectonic scale shift thanks to Glasnost and the dissolution of the USSR, with apologies for appearing to veer so far off course for a moment. During the Cold War, scholarship on the Reformation modernized. It began slowly creaking away from the confessional perspective, that is, Protestant historians justifying everything about the Reformation as God's will, and Catholic historians nervously balancing Luther was wrong and the results were horrible with the Reform at the Council of Trent were right about everything. right and good in the world, and the medieval church was in fact awful. But hey, Thomas Aquinas. So she's a real historian here, and I can't compete with this kind of historian work. So that's why I'm just going to read it. And an important contribution in this was played by the East German Marxist historians reviewing the Reformation as a social and economic movement, power to the people seized by the people, not a theologically and princely political story. Western scholars did not ignore the research, especially with the gradual thawing of relations, and there's a whole big late 1970s and early 80s swath of social Reformation research. However, by the late 1980s, critical evaluation of the body of scholarship had set in. Scholars realized that, in fact, there was really something to the whole religion idea here, and reassessed more positively the role of political leadership. The most important development here that continues to supply the foundation for early modern and late medieval era and increasingly late medieval scholarship is a meta-narrative known as confessionalization. This is another concept that Federici almost certainly knew about, had no excuse not to know. Furthermore, it is a narrative that she could have contributed a lot to. A narrative that says a lot of what she does in a different register, but she ignores it because she is writing a philosophical criticism of philosophy, not a new understanding of the past. Confessionalization and its partner, social discipline, are vaguely ominous-sounding terms to describe the process of state societal formation through centralization, consolidation, and order amidst chaos. From 15th century roughly through the 30 Years' War, Catholic, Calvinist, Lutheran, and Anglican areas with different religious values and institutions nevertheless manifest the same cultural political mores and norms focused on ideally creating an orderly society. Scholars describe how economic life plays into this, for sure, but it's not explicitly a Marxist theme. Again, a serious sweeping feminist criticization of confessionalization would have been amazing. Rather than a small one-off Roper's not-so-great holy household, we deserve multiple material feminist, not just ideology-focused, gender-focused studies that investigate the role of state and civic consolidation through law and through economic activity on women's lives. Federici just kind of seals herself off from actual history and an attempt at furthering our understanding of his story. And so then we come to the reason that no other historians have picked up her findings and directly integrated them into their work, or written, here's how we can use Federici to critique mainstream historiography. When it comes to history, she's just plain wrong. I don't mean a catalog of minor errors here. Her understanding of something like infanticide, in practice, enforcements of laws, from the Middle Ages through the early modern era, might be outdated. Oh well, Queen Mother Goddess Caroline Walker Bynum has plenty of problems like that in 1987's Holy Feast and Holy Fast, and scholars still cite that. But setting these things aside, the uncomfortable truth is that in probably the two most important pillars for her argument, Federici is flat out wrong about the past. I think it was something like, she says hundreds of thousands of witches died when it was really about 40,000, 50,000. As I think Sam Harris actually also writes about it in his End of Faith. Her argument depends on genocide of women across Europe in the transition to capitalism. Hundreds of thousands executed. Well, no, we already knew this at the time. Don't get me wrong, the witch trials are brutal, terrifying, and nauseating. But the actual situation is vastly different than centuries of blanket genocidal onslaught against gentle, outcast herb women. Numerically speaking, scholars estimate around 50,000 total people were executed as witches from 1450 to 1700, about 85% women. Another 50,000 were charged but not executed, a number that includes people granted lesser punishments like a fine or a few days in jail, and people acquitted altogether. Furthermore, the temporal and geographic distribution of these cases isn't anything that would support a blanket Marxist genocidal narrative. And it's interesting, you call Federici Marxist when I'm going to be arguing that not only is it not Marxist, but it's just bad scholarship. Because of this, we drag Marx's name in the ground because of Federici's work because we call Federici a Marxist. It's heavily concentrated in individual localities in countries of religious confessional strife in borderlands. Bamberg and Würzburg were sites of huge, infamous mass persecutions and executions, while the surrounding countryside basically saw no executions. Gender dynamics of which persecutions also played out differently according to geography. The independent herb woman as such trope has all the pieces present in scattered cases, but nothing to suggest a pattern. Indeed, to focus on this type ignores the crux of maleficism, consorting with the devil. Any magic is an offshoot, feeling almost incidental in some cases. Was this heavily female? Yes. Strong sexuality component? Yes. Consorting is often meant in demonological writing in an explicitly sexual and orgastic sense. But looking at the actual contours of which persecutions on the local level undercuts Federici's portrayal of the situation in which her arguments depend. But does this stop people from vicariously traumatizing other people on the internet? Absolutely not. We need feminist critiques and investigations of this. We need responsible Marxist class-based feminist critiques and investigations of this. But if we want to say anything about history, that is to understand the past, we need to investigate the past as historians, not as philosophers writing provocative, but ultimately thought experiment philosophy or feminist revisionist history. So now we come to the re-enchanting of the world, a re-enchantment which is absolutely not possible if we're not going to be talking about complicity and talking about all of the hard issues that actually destroy solidarity amongst us and amongst our different groups and different denominations, and just assuming that everybody is on the same side. Again, if I don't say anything about it, I probably agree with Federici upon this issue. My point here is to look at the contradictions and tensions that exist within Federici's own work and basically highlight why it is that we are ultimately failing in our endeavors to make a better world. So I'm not going to talk about absolutely everything that she talks about. I'm only going to be talking about the issues that I have with her work. And one of the main issues that I have with her work is going to be a very complicated critique about the commons, and that is something that I'm really working hard to build, which is basically a debate between Salah Ben Habib and Eleanor Ostrom. And that is a really interesting key point to all of this. And if you haven't watched the preamble to this video, I highly recommend looking at that video as is displayed on your screen right now. Watch that preamble first. And another preamble is my critique of Bell Hooks's All About Love, which is actually all about the death of love. And this is another critique about any form of re-enchantment that doesn't do the hard work of first being enchanted by our dystopia. So Frederick Engels and Gramsci are key thinkers. And I'm actually a student of Spivak. And I think Spivak has a much more intense version of all this. I think Spivak is my favorite women thinker that's alive today. And I'm going to actually be defending her in a future video where Vivek Chibber and other Indian philosophers are critiquing Spivak. And that's going to be kind of a counterweight to all of this work that I'm doing. So, we must ask, is the mechanization and even the robotization of our daily life the best of that thousands of years of human labor can produce? Can we imagine restructuring our lives around a commoning of our relations with others, including animals, waters, plants, and mountains, which the large construction of robots will certainly destroy? This is the horizon of the discourse and the politics of the commons opens us for us today. Not the promise of an impossible return to the past, but the possibility of recovering the power of collectively deciding our fate on this earth. This is what I call re-enchanting the world. First, we need to find enchantment within our dystopia. So, wasn't it Shula Smith Firestone that created cyber feminism? The obvious answer, men have come up to the moralization of the commodification of emotions and our interpersonal relationships, is robots. Robots for sex, robots for care, and even robots for love once they pass the Turing test. A robot is not going to complain about excessive emotional labor. A robot will love you no matter what. A robot therapist is a one-time payment and will have lasting cognitive behavioral therapy outcomes that will never be traumatized in the future, and that you don't have to deal with the robot's endless insecurity that comes with another person's existential crises.
You know what makes women happy? Nothing. Nothing makes them happy, and that is why they have slowly taken over the NFL, because it annoys them that we can just sit there with like a pizza and a drink, like, that's not holding, just be like, and enjoy yourself.
In fact, once a robot passes the Turing test, who is to say that the robot isn't going to have some sort of existential crisis also when you are gone? So this is the problem with excluding men's voices. Men will go to war for love. They will put their own life and the lives of others at stake so as to save Helen of Troy. Have you seen The Matrix? Neo chooses Trinity over the world. Even in a supposedly non-heteropatriarchal version of Matrix 4, their love is more important than the whole world. In the post-feminist world, only robots will provide actual non-commodified love. If that's the case, then fuck the environment. Feminists have commodified the revolutionary potential of love through my critique of Bell Hooks' All About Love, which is actually all about the death of love. And they have normalized the idea that putting your life on the line for something greater than yourself, like idealisms like community, family, and love, is a psychological problem. It's a toxic masculinity. And now they are fearing the consequences of their own creation, the rise of robots.
That you don't idealize him or her. Love means that you accept a person with all its failures, stupidities, ugly points, and nonetheless, the person is absolute for you. Everything that makes life worth living, but you see perfection in imperfection itself.
Gaslighting.
And that's how we should learn to love the world. True ecologist loves all this.
I was a male feminist for many years. I stopped being a male feminist when I was literally between two groups of feminists yelling at each other, unable to listen to each other's trauma, calling each other and other women misogynist, until I woke up from this insanity. The insanity of closing down critique outside of your own worldview, the insanity of thinking one's own trauma is more important than the trauma of others, the insanity of moralizing the commodification of emotional labor, rendering us unable and unwilling to listen to those that we disagree with. And finally, the insanity of being completely closed to the idea of admitting complicity and recognizing one's own privilege, even while pointing at others to do so, even while pointing at others that they have to admit their privilege, while not able to look at their own privilege because of this power equals privilege logic. Until a feminist writes a book about a history of complicity in the feminist movement without pointing their fingers at so-called white feminism or neoliberal feminism, but by outlining the history of complicity that comes from the excommunication of people like Hannah Arendt from the feminist movement, probably one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century, in favor of covertly neoliberal arguments that the personal is political, and the covertly neoliberal arguments of standpoint epistemology, and the covertly neoliberal psychology that feminists impose upon all of us through academic, judicial, and psychological institutions. Until a feminist writes a book about this, hold on to your seats, because there's so much dystopia left. It's going to get a lot better, worse before it gets better. There is no re-enchantment of the world. There's only re-enchantment in dystopia. There's only enchantment in dystopia. Instead, We need to become enchanted by the landfill and fall in love with the cyberpunk as I have. Everywhere, because of the impoverishment and displacement that globalization has produced, the figure of the worker has become of that of the migrant, the iterant, the refugee. The iterant is an example of the financialization of daily life. As in the past, the foundation of the process of enclosure of land, this is currently so extensive that even areas of agricultural life that in the past had remained untouched, enabling peasant communities to reproduce themselves, are now privatized. And I would say, like that book about Buddhism, where these people from the United Nations, they go to far off places and they instill they instill Western ideas of individual sovereignty and basically are colonizing minds before they privatize anything. First, it's through psychology that they do this stuff. The last decade has seen the largest enclosure of the worldly commons in history. And I would agree. But in terms of circumference, and you talk about this yourself, Madame Federici, the largest enclosure is not the increasing encroachment of rainforests, oceans, and land. The largest enclosure is the cumulative circumference aggregated out of all of our interpersonal enclosures. The creation of and putting up of boundaries and bottom lines that exist between each and every one of us, moralized and endorsed as psychological health by feminist pop psychology that refuses to be criticized from the outside because of the power equals privilege logic, because it has normalized a system of social capitalism. This is the largest enclosure today. In the United States, millions are homeless and on the move. The immediate causes are highly publicized. The farm crises, the steep rise of rental and mortgage payments relative to wages, the warehousing of apartments and the gentrification process, the collapse of the social safety net, the union busting. Behind these factors, however, there is a common reality. And I agree. And I think that that common reality is neoliberal subjectivity, is neoliberal colonialism of the mind, spread by an inability to be critiqued. Animals from protozoa to cows are being engineered and patented to eat oil spills, produce more eggs per hour, secrete more hormones. Again, if livestock can be made to produce more eggs an hour, so can humans. This is the cyborg feminism that Federici dismisses. That is, cyborg feminism continually dismisses Federici's witch idealism that there can be no robot mothers or robot psychologists. Of course there can be. Who wants to deal with the endless nags of a feminist mother when you can have a robot sex wife? We have passed the whole event horizon and there is no going back, as she already explained. Increasingly, the land is no longer valued for how much food it can grow or what kind of buildings it can support, but how much radioactive waste it can safely store. Thus, tired earthly commons, the gift of a billion years of laborless transformation, meet tired human bodies. Exactly. It's too much emotional labor to care about the commons, to put our lives on the line for the commons. In fact, it's psychologically unhealthy to put your life on the line for anything of a higher ideal. It is too much emotional labor to die. It is unhealthy to die for some ideals of community or love that you believe in. Our own bodies are being enclosed. Yes, that is the largest enclosure that's happening. And that is not something that's done by corporations. That is done by a neoliberal colonialism of the mind, a cost-benefit analysis that seeps into even the most precious, deepest thoughts and relationships that we have with one another. You talk about this yourself, but you fail to make these connections. This sentence is out of place. This is the biggest enclosure. Who is responsible for this? The people who normalize the personal as being political are the ones who have allowed and moralized the political to invade into our private lives through the psychological mechanisms of neoliberalism. Maybe Hannah Arendt was right. Maybe she shouldn't have been excommunicated. Hannah Arendt is the modern day Spinoza within feminism, being excommunicated. Appearance and attitude are now closely monitored in jobs. Who is doing that? It's not corporations. And service industries, okay? Acting is not real emotional labor. And this is what I've said before. It is really, really interesting that so many feminists think that acting is a form of emotional labor. Acting is only emotional labor if you are Heath Ledger and you take your character to heart. And that's the only form of real in-depth acting that there is. Service industry job is not real emotional labor. You're acting. You're pretending. You don't have to fully put your empathy in there. Sympathy is different than empathy. Emotional labor is much more labor intensive than acting. This is why emotional labor cannot be subsumed into the market, because the market requires an extraction of surplus labor. Emotional labor requires you to realize that you are doing some sort of exploitation. If you are being truly empathetic, you cannot be extracting surplus labor from anybody, from your workers or from the customers. In 1867, Marx did not see the power emerging from the communal organization of life of millions in Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. This failure remains a key element of Marx's thought to this day. Third world Marxists still speak of the progressive character of this original accumulation. Thus, though they officially fight against capitalism's new enclosures, they envision a time when their party and state will carry out enclosures of their own even more efficiently than the capitalists. They too believe that communal ownership of land and local markets has no place in a so-called revolutionary society. Their aim is to nationalize land and wipe out local markets, as well as to expel the IMF and the Camparoda bourgeoisie from their countries. This is the fascist response to global neoliberalism. Consequently, they clash with the many people who fight against the new enclosures. You see, one of the biggest problems with the left today is the conflicting of fascism with neoliberalism. Fascists are responding to what they see as globalism spread by the academics. The confusion escalates at victory time, when there is a tendency to create state plantations, as in Mozambique, and capitalist farms, as in Zimbabwe, at the expense of communal possibilities and actualities. In contrast, capital's reading of the new enclosures in the face of the collapse of the socialist model and the crisis of the Third World Revolution is the end of history. That is, the triumph of the world market as the mark of planetary commodification, glorified as westernization and democratization. Westernization, long dead, because Sam Harris and company tried to save the West. They had a Save the West conference, and when you have a Save the West conference, it means the West is already dead. The survival of communal ties and the lack of traditional wage dependence have many consequences in Africa's political economy. First, they have fostered a sense of entitlement with respect to the distribution of wealth in the community by the state. Second, they have been responsible for the fact that most African proletarians fail to experience capitalist laws as natural laws, even though the struggle to gain access to what industrial development can provide is now a general factor for social change. It's interesting. You see how we have no choice but to speak in the language of academia, historically Western academia. This is how deep-rooted colonialism is. This deep-rooted colonialism is something that most decolonial thinkers are unable to think about. This is why I have created the hashtag decolonization. This must be emphasized given the tendency in the United States to see Africans as helping victims of government corruption or natural disasters, or of protagonists of backward struggles revolving around tribal allegiance. Those tribal allegiances are really important. And they're really important because capitalism hasn't colonized them yet. They still have an allegiance to something that's more important than money, and more important than profit, and more important than cost benefit analysis. If they were to do the cost benefit analysis, they would probably make more from exploiting their own people instead. The debt crisis has unfolded in Africa in all its mathematical logic, showing how misleading it is to view it as a quantitative crisis as it is usually presented. Look at my Karl Ratner's discussion on unwitting colonizers. I talk about how there's a difference between quantitative and qualitative representations of value and how one is substituted for the other many times. The later technological tools of repression, cars, walkie-talkies, Israeli security guards, have arrived in Africa in the wake of the debt crisis. And guess what? What's the most intense version of that? Psychological tools are even scarier. I like how she talks about the capitalization of the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP is becoming more capitalist. I have a whole video on that, comparing the neoliberal Marxism of the West and the neoliberal Marxism of China. The clearest expression of a logic that motivates new debt economy is found in the new forms of individual debt that have proliferated with the neoliberal term: student loan, mortgage, credit card debt, and all the microfinance debt now affecting millions across this planet. It's so interesting to see how the literature regarding microfinance has changed in the last 2 decades. The end of the welfare state and the crisis of the wage common. Brought to public attention by the subprime crisis of 2008, individual and household debt is already the object of a large body of literature investigating its causes and social effects, its relation to the increasing financialization of everyday life and reproduction, its determination of new forms of subjectivity, and above all, the forms of mobilization most effective against it. The financialization of everyday life, the financialization of reproduction, and new forms of subjectivity, aka neoliberal subjectivity. Workers' resistance is diffused, economic disasters acquire a moralistic dimension, and she's going to be talking about this. And the function of debt as an instrument of labor extraction is masked, as we have seen under the illusion of self-investment. I'm pointing to all of these notes as hints of trying to understand complicity. Here is where we get to a very interesting part of the book. Everything else I agree with, okay? And now we get to the concept of microfinance. It is significant that loans usually involving very small sums of money are mostly given to women, and in particular, women's group. Although in many cases it is the husbands or men in the families that use them. I think that this sentence is truly infuriating. Okay, the amount of literature I have read talking about the success of women being in control of microfinance is so staggering that reading this sentence just confirms that there is absolutely no winning when it comes to feminism. They blame men for being more easily co-opted. This sentence is truly disheartening, and you can see how even in the next line, Federici has no choice but to refer to the massive numbers of studies which affirms women, the responsibilities of women. Still, she has to shit on men as being the reason why this microfinance stuff ultimately did not work. She has to have a line in there about men. Why? Why is this line necessary? When it's just not true, first of all. And this is kind of a feminist revisionism that comes with not just the history of the past, but with facts that are straight in front of us. How many feminist works that are written upholding the idea of microfinance in the last 20 years? Financial planners prefer women, and she has no choice but to talk about it too. Financial planners prefer women because they recognize that they are more responsible in their economic transactions, being far more dependent on a steady economic resources for the reproduction of their families, and being more vulnerable to intimidation. Not just this. Keep reading. this whole social capitalism thing that I keep pointing to, this Black Mirror-esque thing that affects lower class women more, is instilled by a logic of the personal is political commodification of emotions. They have studied women's communities and appropriated their system of social relations for their own objectives, treating it like social capital, so that when the groups are not available, women are encouraged to form them. Microloans are given to groups because in this way, each member becomes responsible for their own repayment, responsible for our own emotions. And should anyone default, each member can be expected to intervene. The same culture happens in the hippie world with regards to radical self-reliance. Joint responsibility, moreover, as Lamia Karam argues in her Microfinance and Its Discontents, leads to a proliferation of disciplining technologies with women constantly monitoring and surveying each other and notifying managers of potential problems. Sounds like a lot like cancel culture. Through this system, as Maria Galindo also points out, the social fabric that supports women in their everyday life is used to support the payment of debt. This has been proven to be a very effective mechanism since microloans are given in societies in which rural codes tied to ancient survival tactics make repayment a matter of honor, and women's honor in particular is essential to the family's standing in the community. Isn't that basically virtue signaling, cancel culture, Black Mirror neoliberalism? Remember when many years ago feminists were arguing that giving money to women through microfinance was a good thing, a progressive thing, a moral thing? Turns out that it's even more oppressive because it's destroying the old social fabric, replacing it with Black Mirror social fabric and the old communal ties that poor people relied on, just like it had done in the West. First, it did this in the West. First, it destroyed communal ties in the West. First, it destroyed family ties in the West, in Black communities. Look at what I say about Cornel West in my critique of Bell Hooks on love. And if you critique the social capitalism that is tearing apart the social fabric of communal relationships, you must be a racist misogynist. You must pay in social capital. If you have nothing to hide, check out the disagreements between Cornel West and Bell Hooks in my All About Love video. Indeed, as Karam writes, women's honor operates as a sort of collateral. Thus, the paradox is that although the borrowers are the poorest of the world, the rates of repayment are the highest. And this is one of the great questions I have for feminists today is, what does modern women's honor look like? Those ancient honor systems have been turned into Black Mirror social capitalism, and male honor has been outlawed as toxic masculinity and psychologically problematic because it cannot be integrated into neoliberal society. It is too rebellious. It is barbaric. Or at least the only way to integrate the male toxicness is through market relationships of exploitation rather than anything like putting your life on the line for anything, to defend your family, your home, or whatever, which is very threatening to a shock doctrine system which enforces itself through continuous vicarious traumatization. Collective self-policing is only partially responsible for this success. Quote, success. Equally important have been the strategies used in the case of defaults. Bank, international agencies, NGOs have been engaging in a true ethnography of shame. Guess what? This is what anthropologists were doing in the past. Now it's the psychologists doing it now. Studying the mechanisms by which different communities culturally enforce their ethical mores, which they can apply accompanied by threats and physical intimidation. And then ultimately this is for the economy. Here you have to read one of my professors on the concept of shame, Christina Tarnopolsky, Prudes, Perverts, and Tyrants, on the social functions of shame. When it comes to capitalist CEOs, we point our fingers and yell, shame, shame, shame. When it comes to our own complicity and our own exploitations, we try to deconstruct the very concept of shame. Progressive peoples have normalized a culture where we blame drug dealers rather than drug users for their seductive exploitations, while in the same breath We blame the purchasers of prostitutes rather than prostitutes themselves for their seductive exploitations. This concept of shame is very interesting here. So, 2 footnotes. As Maria Galendo points out, these women who excel in their policing role take on leadership role in the neighborhood and become collaborators of the NGO. She adds that this so-called empowerment has a specific policing content. Milton Bateman, why doesn't microfinance work? The destructive rise of so-called local neoliberalism. Local neoliberalism. That is neoliberalism. It's neoliberal subjectivity. It works on a grassroots level. The idea of ownership of land was so alien among Native Americans that individuals made no effort to secure for themselves the land they occupied, frequently moving grounds and readily sharing them with newcomers. As sale rights, owning the land, selling the land seemed ideas as foreign as owning and selling the clouds or the wind. Guess what? The water, the clouds, and the wind are now for sale. And why are they for sale? There is something much worse than the commodification of clouds and the wind, the commodification of interpersonal relationships, the commodification of emotions, the commodification of love. Hayek argued long ago that we would value nature if we privatized it. Feminists took this argument to heart, thinking that we would value women much more if we subsumed their work in the marketplace, if we create psychological boundaries of sovereignty. Turns out Hayek should have been following and endorsing Ayn Rand's philosophy in order to get this way. The commodification of love is even more alien than the commodification of land, and as a result, we have made no effort to secure ourselves from this neoliberal colonization of the mind. In fact, we thought of it as progress. We thought of it as moral. Welcome to the cyberpunk dystopia.
Welcome to the desert of the real.
So Federici asks, how can we create a new mode of production no longer built on the exploitation of labor, of the commons that our struggles bring into existence? How can we prevent the commons from being co-opted and instead of providing an alternative to capitalism, become platforms on which sinking capitalist class can reconstruct its fortunes? The capitalist class can be sinking, but they can pay for boats and spaceships. Honestly, recognizing complicity and recognizing incommensurability between our movements rather than trying to shut people up and shutting people out is the answer. But instead, we create even more boundaries amongst ourselves. We have enclosed ourselves first. The new commons will have to be a product of our struggle. But again, why should I spend my time and energy struggling for a commons when there is probably going to be zero return in that? There's only one religion. It is too much emotional labor to struggle. That's what Roxane Gay talks about. Roxane Gay talks about this very issue. The third of the feminist horsemen, Bell Hooks, Federici, and Roxane Gay. And actually, the fourth one would be Gloria Steinem. Why struggle when I can just get what I pay for? Why commit to the struggle? The commons have not ceased to exist. As Massimo De Angelis has argued, there have always been a commons outside of capitalism that have played a key role in the class struggle, feeding both the utopian and radical imagination and the bellies of many commoners. The mutual aid associations that workers had organized, which were later displaced by the welfare state, are key examples of this outside. Firstly, I think that Massimo's work is amazing, and he has a critique of multiculturalism and enforced diversity as being part of the logic of neoliberalism. And I actually my work is actually rooted in Massimo's work, even though it might be my own interpretation of what's going on. The commons, which he speaks of, the one that sustained poor communities around the world, has been broken by the feminist logic of social capitalism. And we will see clearly that I am talking about this with regards to Federici's own critique of microfinance, as we discussed before. More important for us is the fact that the new commons are constantly created and constantly destroyed, from the free software movement to the solidarity economy movement. The free software movement, so important. Aaron Schwartz. A whole world of new social relations is coming into existence based on the principle of communal sharing. This is what's crazy about, living in Latin America. You're kind of like, everybody's doing a dance and you forget about what the Anglo world is doing. Sustained by the realization that capitalism has only more work in store for us, more wars, more misery and divisions. There's a difference between a war in Afghanistan and a war against Russia. Capitalism will not kill us. Okay, this is my next point that's coming. Indeed, at the time of a permanent crisis and constant assaults on our jobs, wages, and social spaces, the construction of commons is becoming a necessary means of survival. The commons is not at all necessary for survival. Capitalism is where we find this idea of survival. Capitalism is what makes all of our social interactions into cost-benefit analysis focused on our amygdala. It puts us into a camp mentality. The commons is not at all necessary for survival. The commons is necessary for a certain type of communal survival, a certain type of equality, a certain type of living. Yes, but capitalism is more than willing and more than capable, and it needs to keep its livestock alive through the biopolitics of the camp. That is what the batteries of the Matrix are all about. Capitalism doesn't want to kill us. Capitalism will go to war in Afghanistan because it can make money off the military-industrial complex, but capitalism doesn't want to go to war against Russia and China. That's certain death. And this is another problem that I'm having with these people who think that that we are striking conflict with Russia and China because of a military-industrial complex. These people don't understand what is mutually assured destruction. Defending against Russia and China is a defense against democracy. Okay, I'm not illusioned by what Western democracy is, but what Western democracy has that Russia and China don't have is something called the rule of law based on our Constitution. What is our Constitution? Our Constitution is something that can only be changed from within the Constitution. That's a big difference from changing the Constitution from without the Constitution, like Russia and China have done. I was a big fan of China until Xi Jinping did that. That's a qualitative difference between the West and Russia and China. So this section I'm going to skip for now, where she talks about, this is actually probably the most interesting part of her work, where she's talking about Carey and Luger and the law of the sea and the commons. And I have to skip this section because I'm doing an in-depth study of Selah Ben Habib and Eleanor Ostrom to be able to talk about this. So please like and subscribe and follow me on the future update regarding that. So back to the notes. First, since the early 1990s, the language of the commons has been appropriated by the World Bank and the United Nations and put at the service of privatization. I haven't defined the commons yet here, and because I have a whole critique of her definition of the commons, I'm just going to take it as it is and just keep moving on. But yeah, the World Bank has used a lot of progressive language, and the United Nations has used a lot of progressive language in order to instill neoliberalism. The other side of the woman's struggle for direct access to means of reproduction has been the formation across the third world, from Cambodia to Senegal, of credit associations that functions as money commons. Under different names, the tontines are autonomous, self-managed, women-made banking systems that are provided cash to individuals or groups that have no access to banks, working purely on a basis of trust. In this, we are completely different from the microcredit systems promoted by the World Bank, which functions on the basis of mutual policing of shame, reaching the extreme of positing in public places pictures of women who fail to repay the loans, driving some women to suicide. So that's, I guess, some positive. One crucial reason for creating collective forms of living is that the reproduction of human beings is the most labor-intensive on Earth, and to a very large extent is irreducible to mechanization. It's funny how, with respects to, it's funny how some things cannot be reduced to mechanization, but they can be reduced to marketization. It is also, this kind of work is irreducible to the market. It's either both irreducible to the market and mechanization, or it is reducible to the market and mechanization. I don't think it's that out of, it was the feminists, the cyborg feminists, who were arguing for this as a form of freedom. We cannot mechanize childcare, healthcare, or psychological work necessary to reintegrate our physical and emotional balance. Of course we can. Of course we can. I need a robot to give me cognitive behavioral therapy sessions every morning. What is your problem? How do you feel today, Brad? In fact, clinical psychology is very mechanized. You have these tactics, you have these tactical ways of moving through. I don't see it as completely outside of our capabilities to mechanize social work, to mechanize psychological work. Just look at China. Watch Black Mirror. Sex dolls and robot mothers can exist. And in fact, they are a logical consequence of their commodification. You move towards sex dolls and robot mothers because it's been commodified. Because who commodified it? We cannot robotize, atomize care except at a terrible cost for the people involved. Yeah, that's why we're living in a cyberpunk dystopia. So now she's talking about situations in different countries where women have been arguing for legal changes. The problem, however, is that by advocating for laws that strengthen private ownership and the elimination of communal tenure, women's land rights organizations have given support to the very liberalization program that has served to transfer thousands of acres of African land to foreign investors and dispossess millions of farmers, many of them women. As Ambrina Manji wrote in The Politics of Land Reform in Africa, 2006, by seeking social change through legal reform of land tenure, the women's land right movement has embraced the language of international financial institutions and contributed to obliterating the question of land redistribution, the African people's most crucial demand since the end of colonialism. It has also underwritten the use that international financial institutions are making of the law as a means for the globalization of capitalist relations and for placing African loyalties under the control of transnational power. Neocolonialism. What Manj suggests is that African women should fight for more land rather than more law. Buttressing individual land property is of little use when landlessness becomes a general condition. Manji is not alone in her criticism. There is widespread sense that the campaign for women's right to land represents the interests and viewpoints of a limited group of formally educated, economically better off, mostly urban middle-class women who have the money to buy land, pay the taxes that the acquisition of legal titles requires, and perhaps invest in some agricultural businesses. This is basically what Western colonial feminism is all about. Now she goes back to trying to re-enchant people. Such massive mobilizations are not surprising. Women play a central role in social struggles because they are most affected by dispossession and environmental degradation. It's interesting when women are doing terrible things like the work Sisters in Hate talks about. Oh, they are sideline characters to the Nazis. But when there's progressive things happen, women are a central role. We cannot feed oil to our children, says Kichwa leader of Patricia Galingwa from Sarayuku, a village in the Amazonian forest. We don't want alcoholism. We do not want prostitution. We do not want men who beat us. We do not want this life because even if they give us schools, bathrooms, and houses with zinc, it takes away our dignity. I guess it's not just Marx who excludes prostitution. A further aspect of this radicalization is the growing assimilation by which rural and indigenous women of the issues raised by popular feminism, such as the devaluation of domestic work, women's right to control their bodies and reproductive capability, and the need to resist the growing violence against them. This process has not been sparked by the ideological considerations, but by the very contradictions that women have experienced in their everyday life, including with organizations in which they participate. Typical is the case of Zapatista women, whose crucial role in the depatrialization of their communities is becoming ever more present. As these works well document, women have directed the course of Zapatism from the first day of its existence, joining the first groups that gathered in the mountains of Chiapas when the movement was still very young, in order to change their living conditions as much as to fight institutional oppression. The law's 10 points establish women's right to participate in the revolutionary struggle in any way they desired, according to their own capacity, the right to decide the number of children they have and care for, to choose their partners and not enter into marriage, to participate in community affairs and hold positions of authority if they are freely and democratically elected, to occupy positions of leadership in the organization and hold military ranks in the revolutionary armed forces. In the words of Klein, the adoption of the law was a watershed moment that transformed public and private life of the Zapatistas. The women realized, however, that their work was not over. After the law was made public, some traveled throughout the Zapatista territories to promote its application and impose a ban on alcohol consumption in Zapatista territories, convinced it was a major cause of violence against them. A further sign of rising feminist consciousness is the emergence of new critical stance among indigenous women who are questioning the patriarchal structures that govern their communities, especially the transmission of land, which occurs in patrilineal fashion. This differential inclusion has major consequences, as Gladys Zulzul, an indigenous scholar activist from Totonicapan area of Guatemala, points out, as it affects the registration of the family's property, the guardianship of children, and the symbolic meaning of having children outside of marriage. For instance, women who marry outside their ethnic groups risk their children being excluded from access to clans' communally shared land. I'm absolutely sure that this is way more complicated than is being presented here to us. I'm sure that here we can see another example of Federici picking and choosing what she wants to be part of her revisionism. The challenge, Zulzul writes, is to change the custom without resorting to the individual titling of land, which legitimates the trend towards privatization, the strategy advocated by the World Bank since the Beijing Conference of 1995. A strategy that women in the indigenous movements have used to end their marginalization has been the creation of autonomous women's spaces. For example, is the Hijaz del Maiz, described as a space for encounter of women from peasant and indigenous communities from the Ecuadorian coast, mountain range, and Amazonia. Much has changed in the lives of our people, says Blanca Chancosa, one of its founders. Men have migrated. The men have migrated. This is a key part. The men have migrated, and those who have remained are the women. This means that we need to know more to move on. This is why we need women's spaces in which we can discuss our ideas. Is it a wonder why the men have migrated? With the commodification of emotional labor, the men obviously come to the answer, what is the difference between participating in this endless social capitalism and capitalism itself? Just like what we're talking about with regards to microfinance. What's the difference? Nothing. A similar autonomy-seeking strategy to boost social participation of women has been the formation of peasant movements consisting exclusively of women. It's not a problem that men's voices have been excluded, because they are toxic. But when the soldiers and bulldozers come, who is expected to put their life on the line? Yes, I'm sure many women put their life on the line too. All these paragraphs exemplify what Federici does in Caliban and the Witch, the creation of a mythology by picking and choosing the facts that align with her own ideology. And it's not just Federici. It's a cancer that exists amongst all critical thinking today, in the academia and beyond. This is not critical work. This is not rigorous. They participate in assemblies, challenge the government and police, and see themselves as custodians of the land, as they are less easily co-opted by men who are often seduced by the wages promised by transnational corporations, wages that give them more power over women, feeding into a macho culture that instigates violence against them. No, men are not co-opted. Men just see what is obviously right in front of them, that there is no difference between the feminist world of social capitalism and the world of capitalism itself. In the world of social capitalism, when you want to have your say, it's going to diminish your social capital. So there's no reason to talk. Just shut up, make money. So in both situations, there is no need to talk because both are capitalism. At least in the old school capitalist world, you could just shut up, make money, exploit people, and finally, you can pay for whatever love you need. If you say that there is no difference between capitalism and social capitalism, be prepared to lose social capital. Be prepared to be canceled. What's the difference? In both worlds, you need to lay down and shut up if you're a man. At least in the capitalist world, you can drive a fast car. If you join these so-called progressive societies, you have to constantly shut up and take on the emotional labor of thousands of women. Once you make money, then you can say whatever you want. On the Zapatista women's mobilization against alcohol, the significance of this initiative is summed up by a group of women interviewed by Klein. When women began organizing, it was because we were suffering so much with our husbands. We saw many women being abused and beaten by their husbands. We had to do something about the situation. In the organizations, women's lives have changed and we are not as oppressed. Before, when men drank, being abused was part of women's lives, but not anymore. We marched with banners and we went to the town hall to pressure them to try to enact a dry law. There were about 250 women from different communities. We yelled and shouted. And then they changed the law too. Marx did not consistently apply his own method, not at least to the question of reproduction and gender relations. Nevertheless, we do not find in his published work any analysis of domestic labor, the family, and the gender relations specific to capitalism, except for scattered reflection to the effect that the first division of labor was in sexual act, that slavery is latent in the family, and so far. In Volume 1 of Capitalism, sexual work is never considered even in its paid form, as prostitutes are excluded. Together with criminals and vagabonds, even from the sphere of the paupers, clearly associated with the lumpen proletariat that Marx dismissed as the 18th Brumaire as forever incapable of transforming its social condition. Procreation is generally treated as a natural function rather than a form of labor, that capitalism is subsumed to the reproduction of the workforce and therefore subject to the specific state regulation. You know why? Again, I said this before in this presentation. I said, capitalism doesn't require you to die to defend it. Capitalism doesn't want you to die. Capitalism wants you to have a biopolitical existence. Capitalism wants you to have a bare life, but to exist. When it comes to reproduction, men will die, will put their life on the line to defend. That's why it's not a commodity. It can never be a commodity. Women might die through the birthing process. It's invaluable. It cannot be subsumed to the marketplace. Emotions and love cannot be subsumed into the marketplace. Because the feminists are subsuming it into the marketplace, the men have decided to create robots. The market does not value emotional labor because the market is based on the exploitation of surplus labor. When you care about people, you cannot exploit their surplus labor. The authors I have quoted, however, have demonstrated that we can work with Marx's categories, but we must reconstruct them and change their architectural order so that the center of gravity is not exclusively wage labor and commodity production, but the production and reproduction of labor power, especially that part of what is carried out by women in the home. It's not Marx that chooses the center of gravity. It's the market itself. It's the supply and demand. A machine-based communism relies on an organization of work that excludes the most basic activities human beings perform on this planet. As I have mentioned, the reproductive work that Marx's analysis bypasses is, to a large extent, work that cannot be mechanized. Of course it can. It will. That's why cyberpunk exists. That's why Sheila Smith Firestone exists. It's called cyborg feminism. Marx's vision of a society in which necessary labor can be drastically reduced through automation clashes with the fact that the largest amount of work on Earth is of a highly relational nature and hardly subject to mechanization. That work cannot be subject to marketization, and if it is, it'll be replaced by robots. Once again, reproductive work cannot be analyzed by supply and demand. Men are willing to die to defend their families. That is not something that can be subsumed into the market. A mother's hug cannot be a matter of cost-benefit analysis. Men are willing to die to defend their mothers. Feminists sell their own emotional labor short by trying to turn and analyze interpersonal relationships into commodities. When you are doing this, the obvious answer for men, and many rich men have come to this conclusion indeed, is to not listen to the deep angst of their partners. Instead, they purchase the emotional work of prostitutes and the emotional work of therapists, or the other emotional work of foreign Filipino workers to come in the house and clean. These professions, prostitutes and therapists, who increasingly try to justify and socially reproduce their own professions in the marketplace, changing laws on the basis of progressive and Marxist ideals, when all they are really doing is destroying communal solidarity and instilling a neoliberal subjectivity. Now, a supposedly healthy individual in a neoliberal society does not discuss with other members of their community about issues that are difficult to talk about. It's too much emotional labor. In a neoliberal society that has been created by a racist, noble savage endorsing power equals privilege narrative and feminist Duluth models through the takeover of the psychological and academic institutions, you and only you are responsible for your own emotions, not the community. Nobody else. A healthy individual in a neoliberal society does not risk losing social capital by talking about their deep angst or existential issues with their lovers or within their community. Instead, a healthy individual in a neoliberal society is one that gets their emotional needs met by a paid therapist, their sexual needs met by a paid prostitute, and their communal needs met by playing an endless social capital game of inauthenticity and virtue signaling, pretending to care about the emotional needs of others while only working to build social capital, pretending to care about the emotional needs of their workers while they exploit surplus labor en masse and make efficient economies of scale that destroys the environment, where the externalities of the cup of coffee that you buy is paid for by the cup of coffee itself. This is our cyberpunk dystopia. Welcome. Welcome to the desert of the real. I have no problem with commodification itself. What I do have a problem with is calling this commodification progressive, which is calling this commodification Marxist, which academic institutions do, and saying that this commodification is moral, and saying that this commodification is progress. When Ayn Rand tried doing this years ago, everyone laughed at her. When so-called progressive feminists did this en masse, nobody said anything because I guess Bill Burr was right. Nobody criticized, especially not the men, because they were too busy trying to get laid. That's the line from Bill Burr, not me. George Kaphantizis argues that capital has a more integrative concept of capitalism that in his later work of Marx discarded some of the main theses in the Grundazie, like the thesis that capitalism, through the automation of production, can go beyond the law of value. But to the extent that the movement could not turn its critique of the family and what I call the patriarchy of the wage into a critique of other forms of exploitation and equate liberation with equal rights and access to wage labor, it could not escape co-option by governments and the United Nations, which by the mid-1970s were ready to embrace edited forms of feminism as key elements in the restructuring of the world economy. There is absolutely nothing that is edited. From the APA to the CIA to the United Nations, all these organizations repeat prescribed intersectional idioms because none of this intersectionality, this so-called intersectionality, threatens the status quo, and in fact further hides exploitation in plain sight under the guise of Marxism and under the guise of progress. As long as feminists don't see and don't take responsibility for the initial idea of the personal being political as problematic, which allow for the political to penetrate into the personal relationships that we have with one another, the unique personal relationships that we have and we build with one another, and it turns into those unique relationships into political, generalizable relationship. The personal is political, which spawned the moralization of the commodification of interpersonal relationships, and feminists continue to point fingers at certain edited forms of feminism rather than viewing the obvious fact of how prescribed enforced intersectionality or the practical application of intersectionality is ultimately an individualizing process which turns every aspect of our lives and even the most sacred spaces, even the deepest connections that we can have with others, into a cost-benefit analysis. Then we are continuing to move further into a cyberpunk dystopia. Intersectionality is great for analysis. Intersectionality does the opposite of what its own intentions want when forced into practice by a system of Black Mirror emotional labor calculations. Similarly, the attempts by companies in Japan and the United States to robotize our reproduction with the introduction of nurse bots and love bots, mother bots, customized to satisfy our desires, are more signs of a growing solitude and loss of supported relations than alternatives to it. And it is doubtful that in the future they will enter many homes. She lives in Latin America. Latin America is great. Automation is the obvious answer to marketized relationship. These feminists are afraid of robots, but they are the ones who commodified emotional labor, so men create robots. Until we recognize complicity and incommensurability, get ready, because the road to hell is going to be paved further with these intentions. The road to the cyberpunk hell is going to be paved with these intentions. The only way to move towards the solar punk is to allow for the devil's advocate to give us the key to heaven. Namaste.